Wonderful. There we go. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Law Society of Nunavut Lunch and Learn session. My name is Stanette Vandenberg. I will be facilitating the session today. I am a policy and program coordinator with the Law Society. Today's session is going to be on an information session on Gladue reports and the application of Gladue principles in Nunavut. We are so excited to be able to host Dr. Jane Dickson, Laura Thompson, and Lisa Tootoo here today. They have asked to, I see, is there an issue with audio? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, audio is working. So I'm going to hope that that is correct. Mark, if you continue to have troubles, please just send me a message in the chat and I will try and help you. So they have graciously opted to introduce themselves. So as I said, this session is going to be recorded and the CLE hours will be posted on the website afterwards. So I invite Dr. Dickson and Lisa to please start us off and hope that Laura will be able to join us shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Lisa Tootoo. Just before Dr. Dickson and Laura and I introduce ourselves, I do want to thank Nalini and Stanette for organizing this, setting up the link. And hopefully everyone has received the documents that I had forwarded with the invite. For today's presentation, we've put together a really small, short PowerPoint presentation to help just kind of guide our time, seeing as though we do have a hard stop right at 1 o'clock. We hopefully will get through it and provide like 10 or 15 minutes at the end for any questions. And then there's also an opportunity for folks to reach out to us. So on the frequently asked questions document, just on the bottom at the back, our email information is there. So feel free to reach out to us. So I see Laura has joined us. So I'll just quickly introduce myself and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Dickson and then Laura can introduce and then we will get going. So like I said, my name is Lisa Tootoo. I recently moved to the Ottawa area. I had been living in Nunavut for approximately 17 years. Most of my career was with the government of Nunavut. All of my career was with the government of Nunavut, mostly with the Department of Justice. And in the last couple of years, I did work with family services. I've lived in Iqaluit, I've lived in Cambridge Bay, and I was very fortunate to be able to travel to the majority of the communities in my work with community justice. I completed the Gladue writer training in 2021. So we were in the thick of the pandemic. So now that the courts are opened up and have been for some time, I'm really excited to now be able to write and prepare Gladue reports. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dickson.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for taking some time out of your day to meet with us to talk about Gladue and Nunavut. I am a law professor at Carleton University, and all of my research is on Gladue in the courts. And I also developed in partnership with the Indigenous Perspectives Society and Royal Roads University, the accredited Gladue writer training program that both Lisa and Laura have completed. I bring to this work the writing of over 100 Gladue reports. I was the evaluator for Legal Aid Saskatchewan's Gladue pilot project. I've also just completed a very extensive evaluation of Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto, Anishinaabe Legal Services Gladue program, and Grand Council Treaty 3's Gladue program. Those results aren't public yet. They'll be coming soon, I believe. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to train not only writers, but some of the OCJ courts here and in a number of communities right across the country. So I'm very excited to be here and very happy to have this discussion with you. Thanks, and I'll pass it on to Laura.
Oh, hello, everyone. Thanks for your patience. I'm currently the regional manager of Tootoo, Inuit Women of Canada. We just, as of 1 week, officially opened our first regional office outside of headquarters in Ottawa. Previously, I was senior writer with NTI and also have experience with the GN. I have been a social justice educator most of my career with a PhD in post-colonial theories and social justice within classrooms and outside of classrooms across Canada. I am brand new at Gladue Report Writing, having taken the course with Dr. Dickson last fall. And I live here in Iqaluit.
Okay. Great. All right, so we thought we would, just to build on the information that we had sent through the frequently asked questions, we thought it would be a good use of time just to go through 5 myths about Gladue and to talk about why they matter in Nunavut and beyond. So why this matters. So despite the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling more than 2 decades ago, aimed to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in justice systems, but particularly in jail, the situation has not improved, and in fact, it's gotten worse. So I think understanding the spirit and the intent of Gladue and its application will help. So if we understand what the spirit and the intent is, and we dispel some of the myths, I think we are more likely to achieve the remedial goal of Gladue. Dr. Dickson, is there anything that you wanted to add about why this is so important?
Well, I think it's very important. And in some of my recent research, which was surveying provincial and territorial courts nationally on Gladue and their experience with Gladue reports, it's become very clear that courts place a very high value on this information. They do find it helpful, and they are quite consistent in their views that Gladue reports are the best way to receive this information. So I'll share a little bit more about that research going forward. But what is increasingly clear is that this information, when presented in the form of a Gladue report, is vital not only to the court in assessing moral blameworthiness and imposing a fit and appropriate sentence. It's also very valuable to Crown and Defense in informing how they approach the sentencing process. And for the Indigenous person before the court, Gladue can be a very significant experience because it allows them to step outside of their story, share that story with someone else, and often it's a way for them to gain insight into how it is that they came to be in the position that they are now. So there are benefits for everyone, and we would, of course, very much like to see those benefits realized in the Court of Nunavut. So Lisa, back to you.
Okay. All right, so let's just dive right into our first one. The myth that Gladue doesn't apply to Inuit. So I think just the piece that I would say to this is Gladue applies to any Indigenous person who identifies as Indigenous, who doesn't waive their right to Gladue. So of course that's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I think that just around this myth, there's been discussion or debate maybe that, you know, the experience of Inuit is very unique, and that Gladue applies more to First Nations groups, or it applies more to Indigenous people in the South. And although, and I think part of this is based on the belief that, or the reality, that Inuit had different experiences. And while that's true, the experience of colonialism, there's similarities for sure among the Indigenous populations. Yeah, Dr. Dickson, anything else to add around just dispelling the myth that Gladue doesn't apply to Inuit?
Yes, well, I mean, I think we're talking to lawyers, and of course, as lawyers, you all know that the Supreme Court of Canada was very clear that both in Gladue and in IPLI, that Gladue applies in all cases involving Indigenous people, unless they choose to waive the right to have that information presented to the court. And Gladue information really is something that, while, as Lisa said, there are common themes to the colonial experience that really span the country, the reality is that the expression of colonialism and those impacts will vary across different Indigenous nations. There will be different experiences of colonization, and there will be different experiences of how communities and nations respond to colonization and the nature of trauma and recovery and resilience. The fact is that having that information is a legal requirement. And so we know that it applies at bail, at sentencing, long-term and dangerous offender hearings before the Mental Health Review Board. It applies at parole. It applies internally in Correctional Services Canada disciplinary matters. And interestingly, what we're seeing across the country, but especially here in Ontario and certainly British Columbia, is that the principle that is integral to Gladue of having broader contextual knowledge before we make important decisions in legal contexts is that Gladue principles are seeping into the family law realm. They have been raised in administrative law contexts. They've been involved in extradition hearings. And in Ontario, we've actually seen Gladue factors raised in landlord-tenant matters and in appeals before the board that provides the Ontario Disability Support Program. So what we're seeing, what we started with Gladue in the criminal context is now spreading outwards as legal professionals in many contexts understand that the more information a court or a tribunal has about the person about whom they're going to make a decision, the more informed and the better that decision is likely to be. So, thank you.
Yeah, and I think just the last piece that I think is important. So not only does it apply to Inuit before the court, it's their right. And I think that there's a collective responsibility that we have in communicating this right to people, Indigenous people before the courts. Okay.
And one thing I would like to add is that it applies to Inuit regardless of where they live. So whether they live in the north or the south, in a rural area or an urban setting, it applies to all Inuit.
Yeah, and if I can jump on that, Laura, I sit on the Strategic Development Committee for the Indigenous Peoples Court here in Ottawa, and a significant number of the folks who are involved with that court are Inuit, and they have Gladue reports and Gladue letters.
Okay. So we'll move on to myth number 2. So Gladue only applies to people who went to residential schools. I think this, where this comes from, I think it kind of piggybacks on myth number 1, that the experience for Inuit was different, and that there are times where individuals before the court or their parents and probably their grandparents may not have attended residential school. And so that leads to people believing that because that was the case, that Gladue doesn't apply to them because they didn't go to residential school. Yeah, maybe Laura or Dr. Dickson.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, we know that Gladue is not just about residential school experiences and the intergenerational inheritance of the range of traumas that were visited upon students at those schools. We know that Gladue is about more than that. For many non-Indigenous Canadians, they seize upon the residential school piece because residential schools have received a great deal of attention in the media. There's a clear expectation that Canadians generally, and the courts in particular, are aware of both residential schools and their impacts. But the reality is that colonialism, again, while there were some broad themes, there is not an Indigenous nation within Canadian borders that was not impacted directly by many of the policies integral to colonization. So again, the background information will vary across nations, but the fundamental question in Gladue for people when we sit down to address their story can be sort of broadly captured by, how were you, your parents and your grandparents changed by the arrival of the newcomers? How did you cope? What sort of things shifted in your life, and what has that meant for you moving forward? How people manage, how people have coped with both colonialism and colonization and the broader intergenerational impacts of those experiences is absolutely crucial to understanding the broader context of, in Nunavut, Inuit lives, and the choices that people make, which are shaped by those experiences and by that inheritance. So knowing who the whole person is, having a sense of who they are, does make it much easier to understand them and to assess in an accurate way and an informed way their level of moral blameworthiness. So residential school attendance is only one example of colonization. It's only one example of a Gladue factor. The other factors, as we know, in the court, the Supreme Court laid some of these out in Gladue and Ipili. It's experiences of systemic racism and discrimination, poverty, marginalization, forced relocation in Nunavut, the forcing the people into sedentary villages, pushing them off the land, the slaughter of the sled dogs, all of these things, all of these policies and some of the laws and the intrusion of what were really alien or foreign religions are all part of this. It's absolutely crucial. These things changed the lives of the Inuit, and as a result, we need to understand those changes in order to understand the choices that people have made, and some of those choices may bring them before the court. So Laura, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. No? Okay.
All right. We'll carry on. Myth number 3, that Gladue is a get out of jail free card. Yeah, Dr. Dickson will explain a little bit about what the research says. But I think it's very clear that if this myth was true, the incarceration rates of Indigenous people wouldn't be at an all-time high. If that was true, we would see rates decreasing, not increasing. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Dr. Dickson.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, frankly, the evidence speaks for itself here. It's absolutely clear that Gladue is not a get out of jail free card. We have seen a rise in incarceration rates that has actually accelerated over the period of time that we have had Gladue in place. This is a trend that does not seem to have been impacted by Gladue virtually at all. We've got just between between 1990 and 2020, or 1990 2020, we saw that the federally sentenced Indigenous population in Canada rose to 30%. That is more than double what it was when in the early years of Gladue, when we were just starting to understand what the potential of Gladue could be. And now we see that that potential has not been realized. Most of you will know, of course, that last year, federally sentenced Indigenous women hit a benchmark of comprising over 50% of federally sentenced women, which is absolutely shocking. One of the interesting things about Gladue Report Services nationally is that there is a real tendency for those services to direct most of their efforts towards the most serious offenders facing the most serious types of sentences. And it's not that those folks can't benefit from a Gladue report, and it's not that they shouldn't have one, but they're also the people who are least likely to be seriously considered for or benefit from an alternative to incarceration at the point of sentencing. So one of the things that is becoming an increasing part of the conversation, both in a research and evaluation context and more generally in the courts, is whether we are actually making the best use of Gladue that we could. There's a growing support for the use of Gladue at bail, and there are ways to provide that quickly and efficiently. We see that in Ontario, mostly out of the friendship centers, by the way. And ensuring that we don't overlook some of the folks who are facing sentences that are under that 2-year less a day mark, because what we know is that most of the people who are sitting in federal prisons in this country started their journey there by being remanded, and then often to get out of remand, pleading guilty and taking a short sentence thinking, well, I'll just get it over with. But as you do that over and over again, it does increase the likelihood that at some point you may be perceived as needing a more serious long-term kind of sentence. It's also not a get out of jail free ticket, because Gladue and Section 718(2)(e) are only one of a series of principles and purposes of sentencing. Gladue doesn't trump those other principles and purposes. So the court will always have community safety as a primary concern. The court will be is concerned about denunciation, will be concerned about deterrence. And really what Gladue is yet another piece of the puzzle to ensure that when a court decides that denunciation or deterrence may be the priorities in the sentencing process, that even in that context, the decision that the court makes about denunciation and deterrence and what that's going to look like will be informed by what is most likely to benefit the person they're sentencing. Because as you all know, we put people in jail, but they get out. So ideally, we want to be mindful of what's going to help them while they're in there. So Gladue is definitely not a get out of jail free ticket. The way we are approaching it now, it's unlikely to become so. So if you're worried about that, I don't think that should be very high on your list of anxieties about Gladue. So Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I find that's often top of mind of people who follow the media, because that's what a lot of coverage has been around in the past. And I find that that's one key message that remains. And that's where Gladue riders need to do more work around public education to ensure that this myth is dispelled.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll carry on. So myth number 4, the myth that Gladue is a tool of the defense. Yeah, I'm going to turn that over to Dr. Dickson to help dispel this myth.
Well, we encountered this one a lot, Laura and Lisa, as you both know. I think part of it has to do with the fact that, I mean, the Supreme Court did really put the onus on legal counsel to make sure that Gladue information is provided to the court, and the court is to make sure that they have a sufficient amount of that information in order to meet the requirements. So the fact that, you know, in most contexts across Canada, it really is defense counsel who is cast in the role of being responsible for reaching out to a Gladue writer or a Gladue service and making a request for a report, and then making sure that that report is completed and shared with the rest of the court party, has tended to lead to an apprehension by some people that, well, if the defense lawyer is out there actually deciding who's going to write it, then they're going to have other types of influence on the report. That's absolutely not the case. I can tell you very clearly. If they're working with a service, the service will decide who writes the report. If they're working on the basis of locating and securing a writer, ideally supported by legal aid, as writers, and I've written over 100 of these reports, our primary concern in the context of a Gladue report is that we remain neutral in both the collection of that information and in relating Gladue information to the court. Our reports should reflect best practices, which means that in the gathering of the information, we are respectful of trauma-informed practices and ensuring that the manner in which we manage the process is respectful of the Indigenous person before the courts, their cultural values, their community, and their family. We are always looking to provide balanced information. So a good Gladue report, it doesn't only focus on the negative. A good Gladue report also includes positive, protective factors in the Gladue report. As I always tell my writers, the bad things that have happened in the person's life, those are risks to be managed. The good things are the foundations that we can build upon to manage those risks. So you should get a report that is very balanced. You will get a report that is fully referenced, which has been the direction of courts in a number of jurisdictions in this country. And we always work to obtain multiple interviews. We try to speak to as many people as we can, because that gives you much greater faith in the accuracy of the report, that we are able to gain a measure of corroboration of the information that we secure, because we will be hearing similar kinds of things from friends and family and professionals who've worked with our Gladue subject. So as a Gladue writer, we're independent. We're not here to serve the defense. We're not here to serve the Crown. We're not here to serve the court. We're actually here almost as a friend of the court, to ensure that you all receive the information that you need, and that the Inuit person whose report we have written is respected, right? That individual, that any Indigenous person for whom we provide a report has their story told in a way that is as comprehensive as possible, and that is related in a manner that is respectful, honest, but also empowering for that individual. So, Gladue has a benefit for the court party, right? All of you get a lot more information about who this person is, to whom you are trying to provide a service. We do more than provide a risk assessment. That's not what Gladue writers do. Gladue writers aren't interested in assessing risk. We are interested in providing as full an understanding of the individual before the court as possible. We're also going to provide you with detailed sentencing options. And best practices in Gladue is that we provide options for every possible sentence. So you don't just get the community-based options. If there's also a possibility of incarceration, we will address what might be the best kinds of programs available at particular institutions, not because the court can order someone to go directly or sentence someone directly to that institution, but the court can always make recommendations, and that's helpful. And I can tell you that based on my experience with the many people I've had the great privilege of working on these reports with, is that people really do gain insight. They really do have that opportunity to share their story, and in many cases they share things with us they've never told anyone else. And I've had on more than one occasion people kind of stop in the context of the interview and not only reflect on what they're sharing, but having that ability again to step outside and look at it. And those moments where they say, I have no idea why I made that choice. I don't know what I was thinking, right? So people gain some insight. And so while there isn't a set of national standards on Gladue, I will tell you that the people who go through my course are taught best practices, and they are taught to adhere to a high standard. And everyone who goes through my course has to write a mock Gladue report, which is reviewed by one of 4 members of the Ontario Court of Justice. So we take this very seriously. We take our obligations to our Gladue clients, our Gladue subjects very seriously, and we take our obligations to the court and legal counsel equally seriously. So we are, quite frankly, not going to be anybody's instrument. We are just here to ensure that the sentences that are imposed, the decisions that are made, are fully informed. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I think the piece that I just wanted to share is obviously, as a Gladue writer, getting information before the court is important. But I think about what motivated me to become a Gladue writer. And it's really about assisting people, meeting people where they're at, and providing a space, holding space for people to start or continue their healing journey. So often people are not able to, and for lots of different reasons, but just answer fundamental things like, who am I? Where do I come from? What happened to me? What happened to my family? What happened to my community? And going through this process and interviewing folks from their family, from their community, and doing the research. Once the person before the court has the opportunity to read their report, just to gain that insight and to have answers and to fill in the gaps and to have a better understanding of what happened to me, instead of questioning what's wrong with me. So that's something that personally motivates me to write. So it's definitely, Gladue reports are not a tool of the defense or a tool of the Crown. The reports that are for the court, and from my perspective, most importantly, for the person whose story it is. Laura, do you want to add anything?
Also, at the beginning of a Gladue report, as writers, we also set the stage for the context of the community and region of the province or territory. So before contact, and then throughout contact over hundreds of years, and also more specifically in recent history. And so that it's not only about the individual story, but also the community story, and how the community or villages and regions have been impacted by various factors of colonialism.
Okay. So moving along, we'll get to the last one, just before we open it up for questions. So the 5th myth is that Gladue reports are unnecessary in the Nunavut Court of Justice. Yes, I'm going to turn that over to Dr. Dickson and Laura if you want to add. anything to help dispel this myth.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, this is an interesting situation because Gladue reports are, again, through my research, are viewed as the best way to get to meet the Gladue requirements for courts. And Gladue courts are one of the central locations in this country for Gladue documents, both Gladue bail courts and Gladue courts at sentencing. And it was in fact those courts that were among really the first recipients of Gladue reports. You know, and I think that we need to make a bit of a, I don't know if it's fair to call it a distinction, but I think that Gladue courts are about trying to alter the process and some of the more formal context of the criminal courts and that criminal process. And there are a number of courts which would not conspicuously identify as a Gladue court or an Indigenous persons court that will involve a more informal kind of arrangement of the players. So the judge will step down from the bench and sit down with the counsel and the accused. They will modify the language of the process to make it more accessible. They may communicate with court workers who are in the gallery. They may communicate with elders, and all of that is wonderful. And it's helpful, and it does. We have heard from Indigenous people involved with the courts across Canada that this is meaningful for them in their experience of justice. But here's the challenge. The challenge is that you can have all of that, but in the absence of a Gladue report, you won't necessarily have that very detailed and deep knowledge of the individual in that room who is really the most vulnerable person, the person who's actually facing sentencing for a criminal offense. And so while all of the sort of the broader trappings of the process are important, in order to be a true Gladue court and to be a court that fully meets the Gladue requirements, you need that individual specific information. The folks who sit on the bench in Gladue court may know the general situation in the territory. They may have some sense of the history. They may feel they know a lot about Inuit life just from what they've seen as a person living in the territory, but that's not what will satisfy Gladue. Gladue requires comprehensive case-specific information, which isn't really something that you can gain just by your experience looking out on the world. So Gladue reports are a way of satisfying the Gladue requirements. The Gladue requirements require more than mere observation, and what is for non-Inuit people indirect experience of what it is to be Inuit. And the Gladue report is the thing that provides that more. There are a number of jurisdictions in this country now that provide Gladue information only through pre-sentence reports provided by probation officers. We have a modest amount of research now on the differences and the approach taken by PSRs with Gladue content or Gladue information and things like Gladue reports to really make us very concerned about the focus on standardized risk assessments that are used by probation officers compiling PSRs, and the much more comprehensive approach that Gladue reports take. There are also concerns about probation officers as representatives of the criminal justice system and the ability to develop trust and rapport, and the Gladue writer, who is not connected with the court, is not an officer of the court, but who is assisting in gathering information and gathering it in a way which is very much outside those standardized risk assessments. So there are a lot of concerns about that. I will tell you too that, again, what the judges in my research generally across Canada and more recently in Ontario have been really clear about is that they want Gladue reports. Gladue reports are for them. The majority of them have been very clear that that's the best way to receive the information. Nationally, probably the most common way that Gladue information is provided to the court is through oral submissions by defense counsel. And PSRs are somewhere in the middle. We don't have any systematic evidence right now about nationally about how the frequency of PSRs, but my suspicion is it's very high. And so it may not be that Gladue reports and Gladue is the problem instead of the solution to high rates of incarceration of Indigenous peoples. It may rather be how we've chosen to implement and respond to those requirements. So I don't know if Lisa, if you have something to add, or Laura, please jump in.
Yeah, I think I would just add, although we have defense, Crown judges and JPs who reside in Nunavut and who may, be familiar with the history of Inuit and the impacts of colonialism in Nunavut, there is a high use of deputy judges, judges who come from out of territory, who may not have the social and the cultural context. So I just wanted to also add that piece that I think is important. Laura?
I just want to add that Gladue reports are about an individual story. It's not about Inuit in general. And so for me, one of the biggest takeaways I have from my training with Dr. Dickson is that as we listen and take in information that, for the courts, it's reflective of one person's journey and their particular family, their particular community at a particular time in history. And for myself, who's lived in Iqaluit for many years and who first started traveling to Baffin Island in the 80s, I have so much more to learn about individual stories rather than just news coverage or more popular ideas of what it is to live in Nunavut.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. I'm just going to go to the slide of how to request and receive a Gladue report in Nunavut. So at present, Nunavut does not have a Gladue program. So a program to train or support Gladue writers, or a program that facilitates the request and the preparation of Gladue reports. So as such, when a Gladue report has been requested, my understanding is that legal aid in Nunavut reviews the request and then determines on a case-by-case basis whether the request for the Gladue report will be approved. So having said that, I think one of the current realities or a challenge is that there's a limited number of Gladue writers for Nunavut. So I'll provide a little bit of information on how, if you're interested in chatting with me more about preparing a Gladue report, and then I'll turn it over to Laura. But so for me, if you're interested in me preparing a Gladue report, then it would just simply be to send me an email. Again, that information is on the back of the frequently asked questions. We basically, discuss timeframes, for completion, like the fee structure, and then once approved, I would go ahead and prepare, conduct the research, conduct the interviews, prepare the report. And generally speaking, because I don't do Gladue writing on a full-time basis, I commit that when I do agree to prepare a report, I generally commit to have the report ready between 4 to 6 weeks. So that's a little bit about how to request and receive a report from myself. And I'll just turn it over to Laura so she can talk about her process and her availability.
Similarly, thank you, Lisa. To Lisa, I work full-time for Tootoo, Nunavut, Canada, and this is something I do on the side. And so like Lisa, you would send me an email. Lisa and I have worked by similar timeframes and fee structures, and it's a conversation we have to have before moving forward. That is the individual requesting the Gladue report and myself. I'm here on the ground in Iqaluit. However, there is also a national roster of trained Gladue writers, which Dr. Dickson may want to speak to.
Yeah, so Indigenous Perspective Society maintains a roster, and what I'm going to be providing, I can provide a link for that. It is posted, I believe, on the Indigenous Perspective Society website, but I can certainly provide it to anyone who would like it. And essentially what is possible is if you are looking for a writer and Lisa and Laura aren't available to do the full report, but I think they would both be prepared to ensure that a writer who is from outside of Nunavut is supported and mentored to provide a report for an Inuit before the court. And you can reach out to them directly. I trained all of these folks, so I also I'm available as a reference for anyone that you may wish to retain. I also provide Gladue review services. It's a general practice across the country that there is a reviewer for reports. So I provide that service in this context. So again, if you're interested in getting access to that list, I'm happy to provide it.
Okay, so that concludes our presentation, or short presentation on the myths. So we do have about 10 minutes before it's 1 o'clock Eastern. And so I just wanted to if anybody has any questions or comments, thoughts, it's really open to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dickson, Laura, and Lisa. We have a question here. I will read it out. Dr. Dickson said there are no national standards for Gladue reports. Is there any prospect that national or territorial standards will be developed? Which body might do the work of developing those standards? Thanks for an informative presentation. And that was from Graham Steele.
Wow, I love that question. Thanks, Graham. That's one of the national standards piece is one of my one of the things that kind of keeps me awake at night. So I am part of a large working group on Gladue that has people from all across country, community people, people working in the courts, lawyers, court workers, you name it. And we have been working on this issue for a while. We have come up with a draft code of ethics for Gladue writers and a draft set of sort of best practices. Before COVID, I was in some very, very, very preliminary contact with the Federal Minister of Justice about this. We haven't picked it back up. I think government folks are pretty busy, but it's certainly something that needs to be pushed. And as Nunavut is really at the start of its Gladue report process, I would really encourage people in Nunavut to push for this, and I would be thrilled to support that in any way I can.
We have a few more questions. Mark asks, how many Métis, First Nation, Inuit are trained to do the Gladue reports?
I don't know if I'm sort of jumping in here, so I just want to really stress to Lisa and Laura to please jump in. I can't give you an exact number. Through our program, we have trained probably 200 to 300. What passes for training? I say this as in my evaluator hat now. Even in some of the largest organizations, providing Gladue in this country is pretty bad. It's pretty weak. So there are, I think people sort of do the best they can, but part of the difficulty is when you don't have any kind of oversight body for the work, when you don't have a set of national standards, what training should look like, it can be pretty difficult, especially for smaller organizations with less resources.
I'm just pausing to make sure nobody else is jumping in. I think that leads into the next question. Gloria asks whether you believe it would be helpful or useful to have a formal or an expansive Gladue report program in Nunavut, and whether that should be seen as a priority.
Well, I'll jump in and then I'll throw it to our writers who are in Nunavut or formerly in Nunavut to speak to this. I think it is useful. I think it's necessary. And I think that one of the things we really need to think about is how we provide this service. And there are different ways of producing Gladue reports that some of which are very efficient and effective and create a much more reasonable turnaround time for reports. I have to say Lisa's turnaround time is really good compared to what the turnaround times are nationally. I think that it should be a priority in Nunavut. I think it should be a priority everywhere, but in Nunavut, in the NWT, and in the Yukon, which has a great program, when you consider the percentage of people before the court who are Inuit, I think there is an obligation to ensure that their stories are respected and told well in the courts. That not only facilitates the achievement of just outcomes, it also is a way of teaching and learning. So I think it should be a priority.
Thanks, Dr. Dickson.
I can
just quickly jump in also. I believe it's a priority. I'm also mindful of the need in Nunavut. But I really believe that creating opportunities to have the government of Nunavut, the Department of Justice with legal aid and PPSC coming together to discuss what their vision for the program is, how would they like to see things come together, I think is really important. And I definitely feel it's important for Nunavut and would encourage that, and could also make myself available to assist with those discussions and with that planning.
Yeah, I support both of my colleagues in terms that it would be very useful for Nunavut and also should be made a priority. My hope for Gladue here within the territory is to build and contribute to the building of a community of Gladue writers, of interviewers, interpreters, and editors. And look, drawing from some of the research, the best practices have been developing Gladue reports in teams, such as in Ontario. And also, I would like to see and be able to contribute to a database of resources that are culturally relevant relevant, that also speak to community histories, because we are expected by the court to write community histories for each report. And so having some type of database for the territory would be useful in that regard as well. In terms of best practices, if we had a community of writers, editors, interviewers, and interpreters, we could learn from each other and build on that, looking also at the research that is being done nationally and across different jurisdictions. And then finally, for the public education piece, what is it if we were to have some type of program here, and how are we contributing to educating more broadly?
Thank you so much. We have two last questions. We have 2 minutes left. I will ask the quicker question first. So in terms of the amount of time that it takes to get a report for bail court and for sentencing, what is the comparison between Nunavut and any other jurisdictions outside of Nunavut?
Well, we can't do a real good comparison at this point, right? Because we have Lisa's in the process of her first report. But I can say that, and I admit I did put a little comment in the chat to Mark about this question, is that Gladue for bail, the turnaround times, Barrie Indian Friendship Center does them in about 48 hours. The Ontario Native Women's Association can do them in about the same 36 to 48 hours. With permission, if the court wants a more detailed bail report, they can take up to 2 weeks. But there are organizations that are providing comprehensive release plans with Gladue components, largely out of friendship centers, that are doing it in 2 days. The turnaround time for full reports depends on how you do it. We've got the team's approach that I teach in my course, is we're trying it out in one jurisdiction, and the turnaround time is 2 weeks for a full Gladue report. And those reports are getting very well respected in the courts. So if you do sort of the one writer, one report approach, it will take longer. But when you use a team approach, and the minimum team is a writer and an interviewer, what we're doing in a pilot project that we're just at the early stages of applying for funding, is the team is a writer, an interviewer, and a Gladue worker, a Gladue support worker. Again, I anticipate that once assuming the feds will fund us on that, we should be able to meet the same kind of turnaround time, about 2 weeks.
Thank you so much. We are at time. I'm not too sure if our hosts need to run. If anyone does need to run, please feel free. If we have another 2 or 3 minutes, I will just give the last question, which is, given the lack of results reflected in the research, why should we put our faith in Gladue reports?
Okay, I'll jump in quick. Don't blame it on Gladue writers and Gladue reports. Blame it on courts. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to say that, but we need a lot more judicial education on Gladue. We need to also, governments need to step up, because if there was a genuine commitment to adequately resourcing Gladue programs, you would have good Gladue reports, and you'd have them quickly. And I think you would be very happy with the outcome from those. But we definitely need a lot more judicial education. Interestingly, in my evaluation here in Ontario, the Crowns were very, very pro Gladue, very interested in having it, as early in the process as possible. So Gladue for bail, I'm very focused on that right now. I just think that shows the most potential, because we're getting Onwa is showing charges being stayed or withdrawn on the basis of their bail and their reports and their Gladue support workers, and that's that's the model we should be emulating in my mind. So I'm going to stop, and maybe Lisa and Laura have something to add to that.
I think just why we should put our faith in Gladue reports. I think it's partly of what we discuss. It's one of the most effective ways of getting information before the court, which is a requirement for the court to consider. And again, the piece that I had mentioned about how therapeutic and beneficial it can be for the person, for the individual for whom I'm writing. So I don't know, Dr. Dickson, if you want to talk a little bit about the research piece. I know in the training you talk a lot about what research says, and I know you're involved in a lot of the research. I don't know if you want to just speak briefly to that.
I would, but now I'm embarrassed because I was responding to Mark in the chat. So which piece of the research specifically? Sorry.
So the question he asked is, given the lack of results reflected in research, why should we put our faith in Gladue reports?
Well, so actually there's very little systematic national research. I mean, my research with courts is some of the only, I'm terrible. The only real research that we're seeing where we're actually going to the people who are on the front lines of Gladue and talking to them about the experience they're having with Gladue. And, you know, I've surveyed Gladue writers, Gladue aftercare workers, court workers, crowns, defense, judges, and it's really the message that I get is that the way that we are structuring Gladue services is actually not healthy for a lot of the people doing the work. We don't support them very well. And so it leads to high turnover rates and a lot of difficulties actually getting the work done. Again, we really need a lot more judicial education about why Gladue matters, and to make sure that, I mean, all of you understand the law. Right, as lawyers, you understand the law around Gladue. Courts understand the law around Gladue, but part of the difficulty is that the law has colonized Gladue, and I think we really need to take some time to make sure that people really understand the community, cultural, and family context better, and then I think we would get better results.
On that note, I am going to welcome everyone, to thank our guests today. Thank you so much from the side of the Law Society for making yourselves available. For everyone who was here today, thanks for taking the time during your lunch break, or wherever you are. If you're in a different place in the world, we're very glad to have had you here today. Just to confirm that this recording will go on our website very soon. And if you have any questions after this, the information will be made available. And we hope that you have a really wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you very much.